Ichi-ni-san. The PlayStation was launched 30 years ago in Japan on December 3rd, 1994. Omedeto, PlayStation.
It's a Sony.
If I close my eyes, I can see so much from that time, clearer than I remember yesterday itself. I recently felt it hit me full force when I saw the opening FMV to Ridge Racer Type 4 for what must have been the first time in nearly 20 years. The scritchy scratchy sound of the CD seeking and the PlayStation's boot screen sent shivers down my spine and resonated through me in goosebumps. My eyes widened at the cool blue lighting of R4's FMV and ears were soothed by the cool AF OST. The small sans serif text dwarfed by a grander picture, the game's interface itself being populated by an excess of text decoration that somehow all fits together with its simple shading that evokes memories of magazine layouts of the time. Though Ridge Racer Type 4 came out 4 years to the day after the PlayStation's initial launch on December 3rd, 1998, I found myself looking at Sony's beautiful grey slab as if for the first time in my life, and I felt excited about it all over again. The development name, PSX, still rings loud for those of us who were eagerly reading the news of the Sony machine's development. From early 1994, Edge magazine followed with further the developments of not just Sega's Saturn, but the fabled PlayStation as well, referring to it as the PSX, going so far as to printing the codename on the cover of the August 1994 issue after the machine's first physical unveiling at the Tokyo Toy Show of 1994. It felt like the future, as my beloved Amiga platform began to sink from the horizon and entered its sunset years. The PSX was another bold assertion of Japanese dominance when it came to console gaming and pushing the state of the art at the time. Look at it, unapologetically grey, with its industrial design on the ribbed edges, a detail not often seen on consoles. When I look at the PlayStation, it reminds me of my late teens and my 20s when I would spend the evenings at weekends dancing away at raves and clubs to trance music. At the same time I was living that lifestyle, I was still gaming on my PlayStation as late as 2013. It's a real feel-good feeling, like the one that rises up in you when you listen to one of your favourite trance records' melodic breakdown. The console perfectly matches the original controller, the circular projections mirroring the power and ejector buttons on the console itself. It feels every bit a Sony product. It had just the same amount of cool as a desirable Walkman or Discman. We're not sure about that nasty looking joypad is how CVG responded to the Sony PlayStation's unveiling at the Tokyo Toy Fair of 1994. By the time the machine was launched in the UK, official PlayStation magazine were describing it as sexy. The memory cards, no annoyance, seem very futuristic. Hot pluggable, swappable, almost tradable memory cards were not a first on the PlayStation, but it made them mainstream. A necessity for the CD nature of the PSX, but they had that bit of Sony cool about them that made us see it as another cool thing that the PlayStation had versus the rest. All of these things made up something greater than the whole, I think it's easy to forget how wicked cool we all thought this stuff was as we sat around reading the adverts over and over for the PlayStation in our Eclipse baggy jeans. Maybe as a skater I've not changed much in those years. Maybe that's why I enjoy this stuff just as much as the day it was new. I don't even really think of it as retro or old, I just think it's rad. One of the most revealing things about the PlayStation is one of the earliest slogans used by Sony in Japan, Subite no game wa koko ni atsumaru, or this is where all of the games are gathering. At launch, the PlayStation had 8 games, 2 of which happened to be Mahjong games, including Majin, which took the game into the third dimension, as well as its more traditional standard view. Tama was like a desk toy, allowing you to manipulate a playfield in 3D to roll a ball towards its goal. And arcade fans were in for a treat with the Parodius Deluxe Pack, featuring the first 2 arcade Parodius games in near perfect form, showing the 2D capabilities of the PlayStation to great effect. Along with this, a 3D first person perspective shooter which had more in common with a dungeon crawler, Crime Crackers, showed the PlayStation could handle 3D smoothly. But it was Namco's Ridge Racer that stole the headlines and the column inches. It was a system seller, hitting the top of Famitsu magazine's charts and drawing all of the attention for its seemingly near arcade perfect port. Sure, it was actually lower in resolution and not quite as smooth, but it ran at a steady 30 frames per second and was running on a home system, bringing the arcade experience directly to people's homes all over Japan. Ken Kutaragi, considered the father of the PlayStation, said that when his team showed Namco a video of what the prototype PlayStation could do, a team member leaned forward and asked if it really worked. This resulted in a collaboration between Sony and Namco, not just in the home, but also in the arcades. The Tekken arcade cabinet was essentially a PlayStation, Namco's System 11 board. The home version on the PlayStation was the arcade version. Certainly, SNK's Neo Geo, MVS and AES enjoyed an earlier symbiotic relationship between the arcade and home, but this was in 3D. It didn't take long before Tekken became the game that everyone wanted, going head to head with Sega's Virtua Fighter on the Saturn. Though some games from the early days of the PlayStation like Tama, Crime Crackers, Cyber Sled and others have faded into somewhat obscurity, others like Ridge Racer and Tekken would go on to become legends.
123でゲームが変わる。12月3日、プレイステーションまた。
Ridge Racer! お先に失礼。プレイステーション用ソフト第1弾ナムコリッジレーサー。
このマヤさんって、名字がないのね。
数学人聞いてくれれば。
聞いたのよ、もう全部。終わった。
みんな始めてる。行くぜ100万台。
プレイステーション。
The ecosystem for the PlayStation was diverse, multi-taps, mice, flight sticks, a multitude of AV connections, and of course, the DualShock controller that set the standard for the next few decades of the system. The general opinion between myself and my friends at the time was that the Saturn looked like a console, but the PlayStation looked every bit like a Sony product, and that meant desirable and somewhat ahead of the curve in design and execution. In other words, the Saturn was cool, but we wanted the PlayStation. It felt like the future and part of our culture. One of these is Wipeout for the PlayStation, the other is a trance music compilation from the late 90s from Gatecrasher. They share the same design language because they shared the same graphics design agency, the Designers Republic. The Designers Republic were responsible for artwork for Aphex Twin and Autechra and redesigning Platypus Records branding, one of my favourite dance labels back in the day. Some of us still listen to Casper Pound after all. The roots went deeper than just having PlayStations in some of the big nightclubs in the UK. The image was being set by connecting to a wider movement of style and design. Psygnosis graduated from the Roger Dean progressive rock album cover inspired artwork, becoming Sony Computer Entertainment's Liverpool studio in the process, and began setting the trends. So groundbreaking was this style that others soon followed, and an aesthetic for the era was being established. The Ministry of Sound and other clubs may have had PlayStations, but the branding used mirrored some of the trends in the game artwork being used in PlayStation games. It's easy to overlook, but the early part of any decade style and image is still very much in the image of the decade preceding. The 90s was no different, but by 1995, people were finding a new voice to communicate with that would eventually morph into the Y2K aesthetic before the end of the decade, with a dash of 60s revival thrown in. So much of the PlayStation's destiny in the UK was set by Jeff Glendenning's marketing, creating provocative advertising, more powerful than God, which almost provoked a fatwa from the local Muslim community and resulted in some deep apologies and a bit of a roasting from management. His work also involved funding the PlayStation skate park, now Bay 66, under London's Westway. Having connections with those involved in various board and so-called street sports brought credibility as Sony sponsored building the park on derelict land under the hulk of a 1970s elevated motorway. For the time, the association seemed natural and not entirely artificial, and the embedding of the PlayStation brand within this aspect of youth culture resonated. I don't think that would work today. It's no wonder that the PlayStation got into my psyche. We was very much in symbiosis. I'm pretty sure that many of my tastes would have emerged much the same as they actually did, but there's no doubt about it in my mind that the PlayStation greatly influenced those tastes. In many ways, I can say that the Super Famicom or the Super Nintendo was the system that I loved, but the PlayStation was the one that I grew up with. I was a bit too young to go to the big clubs in 1999, but I would listen to Pete Tong and Dave Pearce on Radio 1 talking about what was going on at the big super clubs such as Cream, Sankey's, Tall Trees, Turnmills, Heaven, and much more. I was really getting into progressive and trance music that was sweeping the zeitgeist of the time. On the PlayStation, we were playing games directly influenced by this music culture. Wipeout 3 even features Sasha's Expander, which in turn made it onto the UK Top 40, debuting at number 18 in the charts, and previous releases featured music from Orbital, Leftfield and the Chemical Brothers. But locally, I was able to start enjoying nights out with friends, sometimes going out on a Thursday, Friday and Saturday in succession. At least I could hear it at last, not just through tinny speakers, but through a proper sound system. My ears were open to so many new artists, and my bus rides to and from college were spent listening to Sasha and Digweed, Chakra, Nalin and Kane, Oakenfold and Ferry Corsten on my Walkman.
But it's Germany's Nalin and Kane who've come up trumps with their 98 remix of Energy 52's Ibiza classic, Café Del Mar.
I daydream so much looking out the window of the bus every day, dreaming of something and everything all at once. I think that's why I'm sometimes at my most relaxed and contented when I'm on the road listening to my music in my van as I travel around Japan. Though I may not listen to the same kind of music as much these days, sometimes the urge to listen to Bullet in the Gun is too much, and I feel a tear well up in my eyes as I realise the world I once knew has long gone.
For years I've lived a double life. In the day I do my job, I ride the bus, roll up my sleeves with the hoi polloi. But at night, I live a life of exhilaration.
Of missed heartbeats and adrenaline.
And, if the truth be known,
a life of dubious virtue.
I won't deny I've been engaged in violence, even indulged in it.
I've assailed adversaries, and not merely in self-defence.
I've exhibited disregard for life,
limb
and property.
And savoured every moment.
You may not think it to look at me,
but I have commanded armies
and conquered worlds.
And though in achieving these things,
I have set morality aside,
I have no regrets.
For though I've led a double life, at least I can say
I've lived.
Unlike the Attitude Era of Sega and eventually Play It Loud era Nintendo, the PlayStation's marketing seemed more authentic, more in tune with the wavelength of young adults. It wasn't because we thought it was cool, it just was. It was part and parcel of the culture. You can see it in the media of the time. in Spaced, one of my all-time favourite sitcoms, conveys the vibe so well, particularly where Daisy and Tim are often found combining their laid-back 90s best life with watching slams on skate videos, clubbing in the evening and playing PlayStation in between it all. I find it so hard to separate my fashion, my musical taste at the time, and the games we were playing. All of these things were connected and intrinsic parts of my life, and so many others. Of course, in 1999, we was all 16 years old, so sometimes we weren't able to sneak into clubs underage, so we'd have to catch the bus back home with our fake IDs in tow, and somehow score some booze from the local off-licence instead, so we could enjoy the evening playing PlayStation with games such as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Honestly, some of those memories are my best in gaming, but I try not to indulge my nostalgia too much, this video accepting, because I do believe that as adults we also bear a responsibility for the future, and that sometimes dwelling in nostalgia alone is a cop-out. No console, no matter how good hardware-wise, is anything without great games, and with the PlayStation it really felt like it was heralding in a new era of gaming. Certainly its rival, the Saturn, had some desirable software. The likes of Daytona USA, Virtua Cop and Virtua Fighter were games we loved in the arcade, but it quickly became apparent that PlayStation was indeed where the games were going to be gathering, like the original Japanese advertising promised. Right at the gate, games like Ridge Racer, NBA Jam Tournament Edition, it was clear that the PlayStation not just had the guts to deliver solid 2D action games, it could, at least in our eyes, go toe to toe with the 3D experiences we were getting in the arcades. Through the years, the hits just kept on coming, delivered with ever greater vision and depth. Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Parappa the Rapper, Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, Silent Hill, Street Fighter Alpha 3, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Games were grown up massively, and that's just the headline games. What about Colony Wars, Vagrant Story, Suikoden, Valkyrie Profile, Gradius Gaiden and Doom, which was awesome on the PlayStation? Not only did the Sony PlayStation have the Sony style that we all loved, it also had the chops under the hood to deliver quantum leaps in gaming experiences. The PlayStation reminds me of a more optimistic time. Of course, I have plenty of hope for my own life. So long as I get to skate, I'll be okay. And I try to carry my optimism forward to the present day in my work by trying to be as good a role model as possible for the kids that I teach. When I play these games today, I feel a connection with my earlier self, reminding me to stay centered on what really matters in life. It's okay to be materially and financially poor, but never be time poor, and never ever put work ahead of living life, whether that means spending a lazy afternoon gaming on my PlayStation or trying to skate a stupid little bank on the roadside on my travels. So many of those gaming experiences I had back in the 90s and early 2000s are ones that I repeat every 5 to 10 years. I will always go back to Resident Evil, Doom, Dino Crisis 2, and even though it was a Saturn game first, Grandia will always have a place in my heart. Sometimes after a break from the PlayStation, just plugging in the memory card and seeing my game saves makes my eyes widen when I look at how much fun I have had over the years and what I really need to get back into and make progress with. It's like a travelogue, I suppose. By 2002, just as my life was moving into a new chapter moving to Brighton, so was the original PlayStation's, now usurped by its successor, the PS2. As the PlayStation entered its twilight years, one tragic day in New York brought to an end an era. I remember going into work the day after the September 11th attacks in New York. It was a sombre day, a real sorrowful atmosphere. The theme park that I worked at was usually thronged with people, but on that day, the crowd stayed away. There was definitely mourning in the air. As the hours went by, myself and my colleagues made good of the day, but towards the end of it, I remember one of my colleagues asking me whether I thought there would be another world war. I don't really remember all of my answer from that time, but I do remember saying to her I didn't think there would be. But there is one thing that is definitely for sure. Since that day, the world has never been the same since. The wave of optimism that the world had been riding high on after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 crashed down like a come down at 6 a.m. after a night of dancing away to trance. But I still see shards of hope for the future. After all, through people's passion and creativity, the PlayStation was created and launched. It's hard to believe that 30 years ago, I was sat in a huddle at school, admiring the adverts and information that we would read in magazines, seeing the pictures of the games that we were going to be able to play. And I still think the system and its library is awesome to this day. Ich ni san. The PlayStation was launched on December 3rd, 1994 in Japan, and I still think the PlayStation is sick as fuck.